Hello everybody, this is Scott Stengel, Melco Applications team, here today to share some tips on expanded editing. Um, of course, you should know by now that your first choice is always going to be to get your designs made in our OFM format. That's Melco's wireframe format. That gives you the best flexibility on scaling designs, changing underlay types for different fabrics, adding thickness for designs that are too thin, all sorts of stuff like that. Special effects for some of the special fills you've seen Nate create in the past with us. So that's always going to be your first choice. But really, the only way we all communicate in the industry, since we have different softwares and everything, is through expanded stitch files. DST is a very popular one, and also EXP. There's 20-some formats out there, but those two tend to be the largest. So you're going to get designs in, if you haven't already, that are in expanded format, and sometimes if they give you fits, we'd like to be able to do some modifications to them. Of course, it's not as easy as it is in wireframe, but I'm going to share 4 different areas of expanded editing with you to make the job easier. You can fatten up your stitches, you can filter out the tight stitches, all sorts of stuff to make these designs work better. Sometimes before you get the expanded design, somebody has, sized it down 4 times to get it to work on some project. People always ask us, well, what's the rule on scaling expanded designs? Generally this 20 to 30% is sort of the common accepted practice out there, change in size. However, it really depends on the design itself. If I start out with a design where the letters are already bare bones minimum for 40 weight thread that I'm going to use in the design, I don't have any choice to scale that design down unless I want to switch weights of thread and all this kind of stuff. Other designs that are simple fills and borders will sure shrink more than the 20 or 30% that the common accepted policy is. So it really depends on the design. But in a nutshell, what happens is I keep shrinking a design smaller and smaller. The satin stitches become thinner and thinner, and that's the problem that you run into. So I'll show you a way to fatten up the stitches so it'll allow you to shrink the design and then go back and add thickness back to it, so you'll get some nice crisp sew quality. Alright, so I have my project, my object properties list pretty wide today because we're going to deal with the expanded stitch list, so it takes up a lot of real estate. I guess you could say this is the poster child for 2 screens. You just got to have 2 monitors and put all this on the second monitor and leave the one monitor wide open for your design. Okay, so I have a design here which is, well, pretty old, shall we say. I think it was here in 1985 when I started with Melco. It's expanded format, and you can see the colors are pretty bad. So a lot of times also we get asked, well, why do the colors always come in like this? The reason is in EXP and DST files and some of the other expanded formats, the file structure is incapable of storing color information. So when anybody opens an expanded type design in DST or XP, they have to display something. So we pick red as the first color, green as the second, gold as the third, blue as the fourth, as you can kind of see. And every design that you open up raw comes in those colors because, like I say, there's no way that the file can hold exact thread color information. So a good choice is to take your expanded designs, excuse me, run them, colorize them to your thread colors, and then save them as OFM. Now you haven't turned that into wireframe, but you're still a lot farther ahead than having to calculate the colors each time. Did everybody see Nate here? Hey. He's here as usual. Give me a hand, answer questions. Also, as always, we're going to post this for good after it's finished recording, so you'll be able to watch all of it later. We'll also be monitoring the questions after it, and we can answer those for you. Okay, so here is a brook trout that we opened. It's an expanded file, and the first thing I want to share with you is simply filtering designs. We have a stitch filter in Design Shop and also in MOS, Bravo OS, all that will actually compare the closeness of the stitches and filter out the tight ones. Of course, we need to keep the machine moving as we're sewing. And as people do, poor digitizing, or the design is scaled down too many times, the stitches get too close. You can't go through the same hole in the fabric too many times before you get a thread break. So there's a stitch filter in there that will help take care of some of those tight stitches. It is also designed to protect 4 stitches on each side of a jump stitch. Those are going to be your lock stitches, and so we're not going to touch those because we don't want the thread to come unraveled. After that, the way the stitch filter works is it will leave 1 tight stitch, and it needs to do that, and then after that it will start cleaning house. So I have my design here. You can see that it's 21,677 stitches. And if I go up to Tools, and we have Filter right here, and Design Filter off of that, the default setups work pretty good. It's going to delete single short stitches. It's going to hold 1. That's kind of important that you leave that set like that. We could go into that for a half-hour discussion, but we won't. But your short stitch length is set at 4 points. This is good. If you want more cleaning, you can change this to something like 6. And now when I go filter and adjust now, you can see that it's taken out 123 tight stitches, not the lock stitches either for each color. So filtering tight designs is an easy way to get yourself started in Design Shop. It's going to be on by default in the OS software, so it's going to filter your designs as you load them. Got anything to say?
No, I was thinking about when you change that stitch length to be a little bit longer, that minimum stitch length, and why and when you might do that. And the thing that was coming to my head was if you were trying to run a piece in metallic and you needed a bigger needle or something like that, when you need those longer stitches and the shorter stitches are going to cause you that much more of an issue. I was thinking that would be one time to do that.
Exactly. And we don't want it to filter out the first stitch of, say, block lettering and stuff like that. So that is kind of the reason why we leave this set to 1. Again, that would be a whole discussion we're not going to have now, but just know you need a 1.
The biggest reason would be the tops of your letters would start to angle.
Exactly
That's what you're not.
We don't want to filter the first stitch of the column from the underlay, and if you set it to 0, that's exactly what can happen. Alright, so first of all, filtering is a great way to cut a lot of the junk out of the tight designs and make them sew better without destroying any of your lock stitches. Okay, so probably one of the most asked questions that I get here is this jumps to trim thing. So under Tools and Options, we have Expanded Open, Jumps to Trim, 0 for Disable. The default setting is 3. So now that I've talked about that, I want to kind of go through the stitch list and show you some things. So right up here we have toggle the stitch tab, or you can get it down here, but I want to show them both, so I'm going to turn it on. Again, I'm challenged for real estate, so sorry, but it's going to get us what we need. So here you can see in the stitch list we have each individual stitch, and it's X, Y, as well as the length. This is a very important column when you're looking through designs to find out, well, why is this going so bad? If you see clusters of tight stitches at 3 and 4 and 2 points and all this, it's going to give you trouble. Mainly, I see a lot in the tie-in stitches. It will go slingshotting because it is going through the same hole. Okay, so there's a lot of jumps here, and then there's other parts in the design, which I'm going to show you here in a little bit. There's 3 jumps there. Here's 1 jump separated by a stitch. That's bad. We're going to get rid of that. But then later on you can see here's 1 jump. So the question is, here's this design right here, and I'll turn into 3D. Why doesn't it trim the aqua, which really is going to be black, colored dots? Why doesn't it trim between every dot? Well, as we can see when we highlight it, I showed you that there is 1 jump in between each one of these dots. Remember, our jumps to trim setting is at 3. So it's not going to trim because it doesn't meet the threshold. So the answer, what to do there, is to just lower the setting. So I'm going to go to Tools, and I'm going to go to Options, Jumps to Trim. I'm going to change this to 1. Hit Apply and OK. Doesn't do anything to the design. You have to reopen it or open it after that you change it. So I'm going to close the design. Not going to save it, filtered it, but now I'm going to open it back up. And you can see by just changing that setting and opening it back up, it trimmed all the dots because they had 1 jump in it. So lowering the setting, if you don't get the areas trimmed that you want, is a good start. You need to make sure that those have tie-in and tie-off stitches associated with it, because you don't want to be trimming the thread without the tie-ins or the tie-offs. Okay, as we zoom into this one, you can see, I'm going to turn off all the colors except for just the dots, because that's what we're going to work on. Normally, now you got to be kind of careful with this many dots in this close of an area and similar type designs. It might be worth hand trimming the stitches rather than asking the machine to trim every 10 stitches for how many in a row. That's your decision, but for educational purposes, I'm showing you how to add trims, or how to make the machine trim when it didn't originally when you opened the file.
You're doing this with spots on the bottom of the fish. The stars on the flag keep coming to mind too, as one that I see quite a bit.
Oh, exactly. So yeah, there's a lot of times the machine is always going to benefit by keeping running instead of stopping, like I've said before, for every 1/4-inch letter and stuff like that, or every dot. You got to get a rhythm going. Another tip I've mentioned before, I'll go over again, is if I was going to trim each one of these dots, when I digitized it, I'm going to jump from one end to the other, making sure that the hoop is moving between trims. The reason for that is you want to clear the tail of the thread trim out of the hole in the needle plate before you start stitching again, or it can get tied in together and you get other problems. So that's a side note. Okay, so I went over this. And actually I have a better version, so I'm going to close this, and I colorized one just to make it better for us to see. And we'll run it right here. Wow, so you see what you can do with this simple expanded file just by adding the colors in there. Okay, so this is the same file. It's been filtered and the jumps have been changed to 1. But if I turn off all the colors, turn back on my color like I said before, you can see that there is one place right here where it didn't trim. How come? Okay, if I look at the expanded stitch list, you can see that I finish one, I come to here, I stitch, I can highlight a letter and use my down arrow, and I'm going through the stitches. You can see it finishes here with the tie, and then it jumps, it moves to here, but that is just a regular stitch. It's so short, it's not a jump. Remember, if it doesn't see a jump, it's not going to trim. So what do I do here? Well, there's several different ways I can take care of this. Split element is my favorite, and the way that I do that is I just go to the stitch before where I want the element to be split. I'll split it into 2, and that allows me to put a trim command in between the 2 dots so that the machine will trim. So I highlight my spot up here. on the left side, if I click and hold this flyout, you can see that split element is one of the choices. Boom, I hit it like that, and now when I switch, I have two separate elements. So let's see still what happened though. It's not trimming. Well, it is trimming, it's just that I need to change the location of this long stitch as it's associated with the second dot. Alright, so I come in, come to here, I stitch my letter, boom. It's going to trim there, and that's where I'm going to go. So I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to drag this stitch, because once it's highlighted, I can move it up. Sorry. Undo that. Alright, and then if I grab, I want to go into expanded editing mode, and then I can take this and I can just drag it to however I want, wherever I want to put it in there. Boom. I want this to be a tie stitch, and now that I'm between the two elements, I can put a trim in. So now you can see it stitches the element, it trims, and it stitches the second one. So split element is the way to break apart part of an expanded element so that you can force a trim in there. Nate was mentioning earlier, this is the split element is used often, and it can be hotkeyed. So remember we did a previous session I did on speeding up your digitizing. We talked about the Accelerator Editor. That's under Tools right here. And you can make a hotkey for this. Which one did you say you used?
Split element.
S for split element.
Oh yeah, sorry.
And so that's a potential or a possibility if you're going to do that kind of thing all the time.
I have that, and I have T set up for trim, for adding trims.
Yep. Like, yeah. It's amazing. Everybody uses different keys for the different hotkeys for different tasks. I don't have one for split element, but I use T for drawing in 3D, so it's all different. Okay, so hopefully that will show you that lowering the number to 1 is going to give you more trims in your design if it has a trim command in there. Part of it could be going back to your digitizer and telling him that you're not getting trims in the areas between words and stuff like that if he's given you expanded stitching, because a lot of times on the digitizing system, it's the digitizer selects how it's output to include more jumps or less jumps, and the jumps to trim setting shows that here. When I digitized, it was just common. When you switch to a new system or something like that, it just took you a little bit to figure out how to set your output format so your customers would get trims. So it's a common thing. And when files are saved 3 or 4 different formats and scaled and all sorts of stuff, you really are going to lose a lot of information like that. Okay. So that's jumps to trim. Hopefully you understand that. One more thing about that. Sometimes you can get into trouble if you're doing stuff like puff, for example. Traditional machines cannot stitch a satin stitch or column that's wider than 1/2 inch without putting a jump stitch in the center of it. Our machine uses thread feed. We can feed huge amounts of thread for wide columns. Traditional machines can't do that. So when they output the expanded, they put a jump stitch in the middle of a super wide column. So if my jumps to trim setting is set at 1, it's going to trim every single stitch in that column. That's where you can see kind of it's blank. It looks like the stitches are blank. That's actually jump stitches, and that's going to give you trouble. So that's why the setting isn't just defaulted to 1 all the time for everybody. 2 might be a good default setting, or if you don't run into wide designs like that, 1 could be a better choice. But you can see how you can change it back and forth to better help you with the production.
Okay. And as long as you know that's the case, if you see that happening, you know what's going on, and you can go back, change it. As long as you're not saving anything, you can go back, change it, open it back up again, and it'll fix it.
Exactly. So, and colorize it, save it as OFM, and your results will be good for a while. So, okay, so now we'll talk about expanded editing. So I've already kind of explained this, but I want to go over it once again. Even in wireframe designs, you can get an expanded list to find out exactly what's going on with the individual stitches. But there's two types of stitches. There's either a JMP, which is a jump stitch. That is a movement without actually putting the thread in the cloth. And there is read only, I believe is what that is, which is a regular stitch. So there's only two. Now I can change one to the other. I can add single stitches, I can move them, I can do all sorts of stuff. I can drag select them. There's a lot of good possibilities that I can do in expanded editing. And the scale key is another one I'll cover after this. So here's the individual stitches, their locations. This is, excuse me, the movement in X, movement in Y, and like I said, the total length is really important because it can alert you to problems throughout a design. Alright, so I'm going to open just a regular logo because sometimes that's can be easier to see. Here's an expanded one right here. So first I select it, then I go up into, I like to show the expanded points, and now I could simply grab a stitch and move it. We've talked about this some before. I could delete it by hitting the delete key, or I can add a stitch simply by clicking on the line. You see I just added one right there. So very slow process, but sometimes you have a bad corner, something like that. A few extra stitches added or removed can make a big difference on a thread break every time it gets to that color.
So, like with your wireframe editing, pay attention to what your cursor is doing. If you are over where the thread is and the cursor has a little line beside it, that means you're over that stitch and you can add a point. So can you drag your, right, just like that?
Yep.
That means that you could add a point there. If you're over a point itself, it'll look a little bit different. So just pay attention to what the cursor is doing so that you know what you're really grabbing a hold of, and that really helps. Yes, you can absolutely expanded edit. You can move one stitch at a time, and that's not a lot of fun for me, but some people will do it.
But if you had three stitches that are giving you trouble and thread breaks, that's the point of a sun ray or something. Just moving those a little bit or deleting or whatever can make you get through the run every single time.
One other caveat, if you can expanded edit both expanded data as well as wireframe data. So if you are working in a wireframe design, you can use expanded editing to move those individual stitches. The difference is with those wireframe designs, if you go back in and you change one of those wireframe points, it will recalculate and regenerate all of those stitches, and so your wireframe editing will be lost, but it will warn you before it does that.
Exactly, and it will store it that way too. So yeah, everything is just right except for one or two stitches. You can stitch at it, still save it as OFM, and it will remember that you moved or modified a couple of stitches. So this is a slow way to go, but you know, it can make a big difference. Let's say you're sewing something and the I is too tall for the letter O next to it or something like that. You know, cutting off one stitch at the top and in the bottom can make a difference in the height and baseline equality and everything like that. The other thing you can do is change a regular stitch to a jump and vice versa. So back to the dots on the brook trout, I could grab one stitch if it wasn't a tie, change that to a jump in that part that I didn't have any jumps, and then it's going to trim. Okay, so how do we do that? With this highlighted, you can right click, just go to properties. Here is my two choices. If I wanted to change that to a jump, I would just do that, apply it, and now it's a jump. You see, whoa, where'd the thread go? It's a jump stitch, so it doesn't have thread associated with it. Makes sense. So jumps to regular stitches to jumps is easy. Here's how I showed you how we add just by clicking on the line, and easiest when it turns to a line to let you know you're on the hit zone. And also, of course, I can just go in and hit delete and the stitch goes away altogether. Alright, so I want to do that because we don't want that. And we'll put that stitch back in place. All right, so another thing, let's just say that, you know, this M here, I'm getting a lot of thread breaks because this is too skinny. Well, if I don't want to modify the whole entire design, fatten up all the satin stitches, I can just work on this one here. Well, doing the expanded stitch editing would be a lot, except for I can use some of the regular tools such as drag select or custom select in order to grab a whole area of the stitches and make it much easier. So I'll hold shift. Now this actually is selected, and I will grab 1/2 of this, and then now as I move them, you see that I can make this as wide as I want, and I haven't messed with anything else. So drag select is one. Let's say that I'm at an angle and I can't grab it with a rectangular box. There's also custom select, which is right here, and here I just lasso the stitches that I want to affect. Hit enter. Now they're all selected, and I could use shift and the arrows to fatten them up if I wanted. I could do all sorts of things like that. So that's drag select, and that's also custom select. So deleting, adding, changing, you got the stitch list now. One other thing is sometimes designs come in and expanded and they have no tie-ins or tie-off stitches. That can be added to expanded designs. In this case, I'll select it. I will right click, go to properties. Here's my properties. I would have this as only when necessary, and if I put the ties in, I like style 5 if stuff is wide enough. Style 1 is good here. 6 or 7 points is best, and then you just put it in there. So now you can see in this design, hey, there's another thing. TO, tie off, TI, tie in. This actually adds lock stitches to expanded files.
Good. That's pretty cool. That's one of the few properties you can add to expanded. Expanded doesn't do properties so much.
Yeah, makes a big difference when you don't have ties in your design. You can tell when you sew things out, what's the good term, swimming stitches. If it's not tied in, because there is no tight stitches at the beginning, sometimes as it starts walking, those stitches are not attached, and so it will sort of hang out to the side, loop, stuff like that. So that's how to add lock stitches to expanded designs. Alright, last thing I want to share with you is the scale key. Man, this is a very, very cool feature here. So I'm going to open another old design. It was here when I started. It's a pretty cool fox design, huh? I like that. And it's pretty good size. This is all expanded, and so first thing I can do is I could select the whole design. I right click, scale is 3 down, and when this comes up I have control over the size. I could say make this 90% of the original size. It's locked, so it's one's going to affect the other, proportional. And it's going to scale it down. This one is important right here, expanded stitch processing. If this is unchecked, then what it's going to do is either push all the stitches closer together if I'm scaling down, or it's going to pull them farther apart if I'm scaling up. This kind of preserves the stitch integrity, such as what your fills look like, things like this. However, you go too far one direction or the other, you either have too high a density or you can see the fabric through the stitching, neither of which is good. So generally we leave this checked. What this kind of does is as you scale it, it looks at stitch locations and goes, you know, in this whole area, these are about the same distance, they're about the same density, so let's make that a fill. And it sort of engineers backwards to try and keep things consistent for you. But when you scale, you will lose a lot of your fill patterns and stuff like that. It just would have a hard time calculating things like that.
If it's a normal step pattern, you're less likely to notice it. But if you have one of those pattern fills where it's kind of embossed looking,
yes,
that's when you're going to notice it.
Yes. And there's, of course, as we've spoke before, I could convert this to wireframe, but when you're doing that, you're really reverse engineering a lot, and you're going to get a little distortion each time that you do it. A second way to do that, convert to wireframe, is not to convert the entire design, but just to convert the part you need to work on. Alright, so scaling, I think we've explained, set it to 90, hit it, and it's going to scale 10% down. It's also going to lower the stitch count because expanded stitch processing was on. Alright, so also in there, let's just say that I had this design, but you know, the fill wasn't enough. I needed more fill density in here. You can affect that down here through the scale factor section of the window. And so I would just say fill density, you know, I want you to be 150%. And then boom, as I do that, it calculates it in. You can see how many stitches it added, 50% more of the density. And vice versa, I have too much, I can lighten it up.
So this is, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
This is where this changes actually quite drastically from dealing with a wireframe design. Scale factors exists in wireframe designs as well, but with things like density, it is going to be multiplying that scale factor by the density number, which is the space between the stitches. So the larger number, the farther apart the stitches get. With expanded, it is doing that off of the stitch like count. So I need 150% times the number of stitches. So the bigger the number, the more stitches you have, the closer they are.
Yes.
So it works very differently between expanded and wireframe. So if you do it wrong, like some people we know, just hit undo.
Good old undo.
And do it the other way.
Undo saves a lot. Okay, so I can, without converting to wireframe and getting the distortion, I can use these to just simply add or remove density or lengthen my stitch length in the fill, change the stitch length of walk stitches. Again, it has to calculate, well, what is a walk stitch and what's a column and what's a fill? So you're always going to get a little distortion in the process. This is my favorite though right here, is the column width. Let's just say that you get an expanded design in from one of your customers, you sew it on your machine, and man, these letters are just too thin. You can just go in here and add a point or two, try one, because what number you put in here, it doubles because it's to each side. One is good, one isn't enough, try two, you can get it figured out, and it's a simple way to basically add thickness and crispness to expanded designs without having to go through editing to wireframe and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Alright.
Same thing if some of your outlines aren't quite lining up.
Exactly, yeah, that's a huge one. Okay, but then it can also be used on parts of designs, and this is the way that I like to use it because it doesn't interfere with the rest of the design that might be fine. So in this case, our example would be, you know what, the design's beautiful, but it was the eyes were digitized for a thicker thread, and so it just doesn't quite cover enough. So what I do is find that color. In that case, it's going to be color 1, green. And I can right click, I can go to scale factor. Here I'm going to say, you know what, I need some more density for the columns because those eyes are columns, and so I'll go 125% of normal. It went up by, oh, I don't know, 50 or 100 stitches like that. So here I have just made the eyes more dense without affecting the rest of the design. So what's happening on this one? I left this on purpose so I could show you. Wow, every time I do this, it's trimming every stitch in the eyes. Look at all the trims that it put in. How come? Oh yeah, because under Tools Options, I have this still set at 1. If I put this to 3 and reopen the design, it's going to give me satin stitches like I need. So I'll show you that. So you can't forget that it's set to something that you're not used to. So here you can see that it gives me full stitches in the eyes where it trimmed every single one before.
Did you expand the green?
Yep.
Way better.
See? 1 instead of 14 million. So hopefully I've helped you with expanded editing, and you can see that there's some stuff you can do at a high level that is not going to take you forever to dive into, but still will make quite a difference in lessening your thread breaks, thickening up and improving the quality, and also filtering out tight stitches and all that kind of stuff. So enjoyed it, hope you got something out of it, and we will look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.